My daughter handed me a note during her wedding. Her hands were shaking. 3 words that changed everything, Dad. Help me. I had spent my whole life trusting patterns. Not words, not smiles. Not rehearsed charm. Patterns never lie. And that was why the first time he asked about the edge of my land, I felt a quiet ripple inside my chest. Nothing sharp, nothing loud, just awareness. We were standing in the kitchen, morning light across the counter, coffee cooling in his hand. His eyes drifting past the meadow toward the trees, he asked where my property stopped. Said it like idle curiosity, like talk about weather. I answered without thinking, because at the time, I had no reason not to. But when he asked again days later, then again the following visit, always casual, always framed as interest, something inside me tightened. I had designed machinery for decades, retired now. But my mind never stopped measuring repetition. And repetition without reason is never innocent. My daughter laughed it off each time, told me I was overthinking. Said city people were fascinated by open land. She was happy. Glowing in a way I had not seen since before her mother died. And I wanted that happiness to last. I wanted to be wrong. I watched him move through the house like he belonged, polite, attentive, helping with dishes, complimenting meals that came from recipes older than both of them. But his eyes kept drifting outward, calculating, measuring, not admiring. I knew the difference. This ranch had been built with patience, with sacrifice, with years of quiet work beside a woman who believed land was security, not leverage. After she died, the silence here grew heavier. My daughter filled some of it when she visited, her laughter echoing through rooms that remembered another voice. And the thought of losing her trust felt heavier than any threat I could name. That was the conflict that kept me still. Intuition pulling one way, love pulling another. I told myself curiosity was not a crime, that questions alone did not make a man dangerous. Yet every visit added weight to the same scale, always the boundary, always the future, always framed as planning, never as memory or meaning. I sat alone one evening on the porch after they left. The sun dropping behind the trees he liked to stare at. And I asked myself a question I had avoided for weeks. Not whether he wanted my land, but whether he saw my daughter as the path to it. The answer did not come in words. It came in the same quiet certainty that had guided every hard decision of my life. Something was wrong. And pretending otherwise would not make it go away after my wife died. The ranch stopped feeling large and started feeling exposed. Every room holding echoes instead of voices. Every window reflecting time instead of light. We bought this land decades earlier when no one wanted it, when it was scrub and promise and dust on our boots. She saw beauty where others saw inconvenience. She believed land was freedom, not something to sell when prices climbed. And when she was gone, I kept that belief alive by staying exactly the same truck, same clothes, same habits. I learned early that comfort invites questions, and questions invite expectations. So I lived quietly on purpose, never flashy, never interesting to the wrong kind of people. That choice had protected us for years until it didn't. The truth about my finances was simple and carefully buried. My career as an engineer paid well enough, but the real stability came from patience and invention. A small component I designed decades ago kept paying royalties long after I retired. Nothing glamorous, nothing anyone would brag about, but steady and reliable like everything else I valued. I invested slowly, avoided noise, avoided risk. Watched accounts grow while life stayed modest. My daughter knew we were comfortable. She did not know numbers. I wanted her to choose people who liked her laughter, not her inheritance. I wanted her life shaped by values, not suspicion. Money changes how people look at you, even people who love you. And I had watched too many families rot from the inside once wealth became the loudest voice in the room. So I kept it quiet, believing silence was protection. That belief began to crack as patterns stacked higher. Questions about boundaries led to questions about planning. Planning led to comments about age, and age led to conversations that felt rehearsed. Framed as concern, delivered as opportunity. I pulled the old deed from my desk one night and held it in my hands, paper yellowed, edges worn. A reminder of choices made long before anyone thought this land mattered. Its value had grown without changing who I was, that now someone else was measuring it. Not for memory, not for meaning, but for leverage. And the most dangerous part was not that he wanted it. The dangerous part was that my daughter did not know what it represented. She thought this place was just home, not a prize. And that made her vulnerable in a way money never had. I realized then that staying quiet had limits, and that protecting her might require stepping out of the shadows I had chosen, even if doing so risked the one thing I feared losing most. Her trust. I made the call the next morning. Not because I wanted answers, but because I needed certainty. Uncertainty is what lets fear grow teeth. I asked my attorney to look into him quietly. Nothing dramatic, just confirmation. I told myself this was diligence. Not accusation. Days passed slower than usual. Every sound in the house felt louder. Every visit from them felt heavier. I watched him joke with my daughter. Watched her lean into him with trust I recognized. The same trust her mother once had in me. And I wondered how many mistakes are made because we confuse kindness with safety. When the call finally came, her voice was careful, measured. The way professionals speak when they know the truth will bruise. She said his record was clean on the surface, licensed, employed, no criminal history. And for a moment, I felt relief wash through me, a dangerous relief. The kind that invites complacency. Then she paused. And silence filled the space between us. She told me she had gone deeper. Not legally wrong, but ethically revealing. Past engagements, short timelines. Wealthy families, always the same pattern. Charm first, proximity second. Access third, separation last. No lawsuits, no noise. Just quiet endings followed by financial restructuring. The families never spoke publicly. Money has a way of smoothing sharp edges when pride is involved. She explained it without judgment, without drama. Just facts stacked carefully, like evidence waiting for a courtroom that never came. My hands tightened around the phone as she spoke, because patterns had become proof. Not legal proof yet, but moral certainty. This was not a misunderstanding, not bad timing. Not my imagination protecting old instincts. This was a man who saw relationships as entry points. And my daughter as a corridor. I ended the call and sat alone, staring at the wall where my wife once hung photographs of seasons changing. I thought about telling my daughter immediately, imagined her face folding in disbelief. Imagined her defending him, explaining him, choosing love over suspicion because that is what good people do. I knew if I spoke now, I would lose her trust even if I was right. And if I waited too long, I might lose her safety instead. That was the balance I had to hold. Patience against urgency, silence against protection. I chose patience, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something essential. Truth delivered too early can sound like control, and truth delivered without proof can feel like betrayal. I decided then that I would not confront him. Not yet. I would watch, listen, document. Let him reveal himself in his own words, because predators rely on confidence. And confidence always leaves fingerprints. My job was not to stop him with force. My job was to let him believe he was winning, long enough to ensure he never could again. He stopped circling and moved closer after that. The questions shifted from casual to purposeful, framed as concern, wrapped in responsibility. He talked about planning for the future like it was an obligation, not a choice, always careful with his tone, always respectful, but always steering the conversation toward control. One afternoon, he sat across from me in my study, papers neatly stacked, posture practiced, and spoke about estate planning, trusts, efficiency, and protection. He mentioned my age without saying it outright, implied fragility without sounding cruel. I listened, nodded, asked neutral questions, because the fastest way to expose intent is to remove resistance. People reveal more when they think they are safe. And he thought he was. He offered help without charge. Family helping family, that was the phrase he used. The same phrase my wife used when neighbors needed fences repaired or animals moved. But the meaning was different here. His help came with forms, authority, access. Power of attorney mentioned like an insurance policy. Something you hope you never need, but should sign anyway. I felt the chill behind the words, the careful normalization of control. The way he positioned himself as necessary, indispensable. I asked why he cared so much. He smiled and spoke about love, about wanting to protect my daughter, about making sure nothing complicated her future. And that was the most revealing part, because real protectors do not rush control. They respect boundaries. He never once asked what I wanted, only what made sense long term, as if my life were already transitioning into paperwork. When he left that day, confident and satisfied, I knew the window had closed. Hesitation would now look like resistance, and resistance would make him adjust his approach. So I committed fully to the role he expected, the agreeable father, the aging landowner grateful for guidance. I called my attorney again, told her everything, every word, every implication. I asked for surveillance, documentation, witnesses, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted consequences that could not be negotiated away. She warned me about risks, about escalation, about the emotional cost if my daughter discovered this path. I accepted all of it because the alternative was worse. Letting someone who measured people like assets stand beside my daughter and call himself family. From that moment forward, every smile I gave him was deliberate. Every agreement calculated. Patience became my weapon, and silence became my shield. The confirmation came faster than I expected. Not through suspicion, but through arrogance. Confidence loosens tongues faster than pressure ever could. The investigator called me one evening and told me she had something I needed to hear in person. Her voice was steady but firm, the kind that carries weight without drama. We sat in my study with the door closed, dusk pressing against the windows, and she played the recording. His voice filled the room, casual, amused, stripped of the careful warmth he used around my daughter. He spoke about me like a problem already solved, about my age like a deadline, about my home like inventory waiting to be liquidated. Every sentence confirmed what instinct had whispered for months. He spoke about marriage as a phase, about patience as a tactic, about trust as a resource to be drained, not earned. There was no anger in his voice, no urgency, just calculation. Which was worse, he described scenarios, accidents framed as inevitabilities, paperwork framed as kindness, and when he laughed, it was at the idea of how easy it would be, how invisible, how clean. I sat perfectly still, listening to a man outline my erasure as if it were a business plan. And in that moment, something important happened inside me. Fear disappeared, rage flickered, then settled. What remained was clarity, because monsters who explain themselves believe the world belongs to them. And that belief is always exploitable. When the recording ended, silence settled heavy between us. The investigator looked at me carefully. Waiting for reaction, I thanked her, calmly, deliberately, because emotion would cloud what came next. I understood now that this was no longer about suspicion or even protection. It was about timing, exposure, and certainty. If I moved too soon, he would deny, manipulate. twist the narrative into confusion if I waited too long. My daughter would stand at an altar beside someone planning her future like a ledger. The path forward narrowed into something precise. Controlled. I would let him continue, let him prepare, let him believe every door was opening. Because when a man thinks he has already won, he stops guarding his words. And those words would be the reason he never touched another family again. Patience was no longer restraint. It was strategy, and I committed to it fully, knowing the cost and willing to pay it to ensure the ending was final. Not emotional, but irreversible, once certainty replaced doubt. Planning became simple, not easy, but clear. I gathered the people who understood restraint. My attorney, the investigator, and one quiet agreement with myself. No confrontation without witnesses. No accusations without proof. No protection that relied on belief alone. We met late in the evening, voices low, windows dark, and laid out a path that would let the truth surface on its own, not forced, not rushed, but undeniable. The goal was not humiliation. It was removal, ensuring he could not explain his way out, could not rewrite what he had said when he believed no one important was listening. Consequences needed light, and light required timing. We chose the moment carefully, not a private room where doubt could linger, but a public setting where behavior mattered, where words carried weight, and where denial would collapse under its own pressure. The wedding itself became the unavoidable crossroads, not because I wanted drama, but because he would feel safest there, surrounded by people. Convinced commitment had already sealed his success. That confidence would make him careless. My role was to remain unchanged. Supportive, cooperative, the father who trusted him. The man he believed he had already disarmed. I met with him again, listened to more plans, nodded at more suggestions, and each time he grew bolder, more specific, more convinced I was dependent on him. Predators escalate when they sense compliance. And I gave him just enough to hang himself with his own certainty. Every safeguard was put in place quietly. Legal protections activated. Law enforcement notified discreetly. Evidence secure beyond deletion or denial. My daughter protected without her knowing she was being protected. That part was the hardest, watching her plan a future that I knew was built on a lie. Smiling through fittings, guest lists, and conversations about happiness. I told myself that temporary pain was better than permanent damage. That shock in front of truth was better than comfort in deception. And when doubt crept in late at night, I returned to the recording, to his voice speaking about her like collateral, about me like an obstacle. And I remembered why this had to be done this way. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. Because justice without clarity is just another story people argue about. And I needed an ending no one could question. The days leading up to the wedding moved forward like nothing was wrong, which made everything feel heavier. Preparations filled the ranch with noise. Chairs stacked, flowers arriving, voices laughing where silence once lived. My daughter floated through it all with practiced excitement. But I began to notice the small fractures, the pauses before she answered questions. The way her smile reached her mouth, but not her eyes. Late at night, I saw her sitting alone on the porch steps, staring into the dark like she was listening for something she hoped was not there. I wanted to sit beside her, to say everything, but I held still. Because truth spoken too early can sound like fear. And she needed clarity, not panic. He played his role flawlessly in public. Attentive, charming, generous with compliments. The kind of man people trust because he mirrors what they expect to see. But in private moments, his patience thinned. Questions sharpened. Plans became more urgent. He spoke about life after the wedding as if it were already settled. About change as something inevitable. I watched my daughter absorb these conversations quietly. Nodding without committing, her body language closed in on itself. the confidence she once had replaced by something cautious. I realized then that she was listening more than she was sharing, that something inside her was resisting, even if she could not yet name it. And that realization both relieved and terrified me, because discovery without support can break a person just as easily as deception. The night before the ceremony, the ranch was full of people and empty of peace. Laughter echoed from the rehearsal dinner. Glasses clinked, speeches praised love and destiny. And I raised my glass with the rest, delivering the words expected of me, while watching my daughter from across the table. She barely touched her food. Her hands trembled when she lifted her drink. And when our eyes met, there was a question there, unspoken, searching. I gave her a small nod, nothing obvious. Just enough to tell her she was not alone, that whatever she was feeling was real, and that she did not have to carry it silently. I did not know then what choice she would make, only that something inside her was preparing to stop the momentum, and that by morning, patience would finally give way to truth. The ceremony began like any other, music drifting across the lawn, guests settling into their seats, sunlight catching on glass and fabric. My daughter walked beside me, her arm looped through mine, her grip tighter than I remembered, her breathing shallow, measured, like someone holding themselves together by will alone. I whispered that she looked beautiful, and she nodded without speaking. When I took my seat and the officiant began, I watched her face instead of listening to the words, watched the way her eyes never left his. Not with love, but with fear held in check. And then, in the space where vows were supposed to steady her, her hand moved to the bouquet. Deliberate and final, she stepped forward. Not toward him, but toward me, slipped a folded note into my hand. Her fingers cold, her eyes glossy but resolved. Everything slowed in that moment. Sound dulled, air thickened. I opened the paper and read 3 words written in a hand I knew better than my own. Dad helped me. Nothing else, no explanation, no panic. Just truth distilled into surrender. I stood before anyone could react. My chair scraping softly against the ground, and the world shifted. Murmurs rose. Confusion rippled outward. He turned toward me smiling at first, then questioning, then angry. And when I looked back at my daughter and asked her what was wrong, her voice finally broke free. She spoke clearly at first, then faster, words tumbling out now that the dam had cracked. She told everyone she had heard him the night before, heard him planning, laughing, talking about accidents, paperwork, control. She said he thought she was too naive to understand, too trusting to notice. His face changed with every sentence. Charm dissolving into denial, denial into fury. He reached for her arm, and that was enough. Deputies moved in from the crowd, hands firm, practiced. Witnesses to everything unfolding. He shouted about lies, hysteria, manipulation. But truth has weight, and it presses down when exposed. My daughter stepped back into my side, shaking but standing, and as they led him away, I realized patience had done what anger never could. It had protected her in front of everyone, without a single doubt left behind. The hours after blurred together, statements taken, guests drifting away in stunned silence, flowers wilting under afternoon sun, the celebration dissolving into aftermath. My daughter sat beside me on the porch, steps still in her dress, veil discarded, eyes red but focused. She apologized again and again, not for stopping the wedding, but for doubting herself, for waiting, for being afraid to trust what she heard. I told her fear does not mean weakness. It means something inside you is trying to protect you, and learning when to listen to that voice is part of growing up. Not something to be ashamed of. She leaned into me then, exhausted. And for the first time that day, I felt the weight lift slightly. When things finally quieted, I told her the rest. Not all at once, but carefully. About the investigation, the recordings, the pattern he had followed before her. I watched understanding replace confusion on her face. Then grief, not for him, but for the future she thought she was building. She asked why I never told her sooner, and I answered honestly. Because truth without proof can feel like control. And I never wanted her to choose between love and loyalty. I wanted her to choose clarity, and she nodded, slowly, realizing that the choice she made at the altar had been hers alone. Supported, not steered. That mattered more than she realized in that moment. Later, after the house emptied, after the last car disappeared down the drive, she asked a question that surprised her as much as me. She asked how much money I actually had, not with curiosity, but with understanding. I told her calmly. Explained the ranch value, the investments, the royalties. Watched her process the scale of what he had been after. She laughed once, sharp and hollow, then shook her head, saying she never felt rich. I told her that was intentional. That wealth should protect life, not define it. And that her inheritance was already structured to keep her safe from exactly this kind of person. No spouse access, no pressure, no loopholes. She listened quietly, absorbing a truth that reframed everything. And when she finally said she wished her mother were there, we sat in silence together, knowing some lessons arrive only through loss. And that surviving them together was its own kind of inheritance. 3 months passed before life found a new rhythm. The noise faded, the gossip moved on, and consequences settled where they belonged. Charges were filed, statements reviewed, deals made quietly, and rooms my daughter never had to enter. Probation, restitution, a permanent end to the career he used as a weapon. It was not dramatic justice, but it was real. And real consequences last longer than outrage. My daughter came home to the ranch for a while. Not to hide, but to heal. She started therapy. Took long walks through the fields. Relearned how to trust her own thoughts without questioning every instinct. I watched her grow steadier week by week. Still changed, but not broken. Sadness mixed with strength. Wisdom earned the hard way. I stayed exactly where I had always been. Same house, same truck, same routines, but something inside me softened. The vigilance eased, replaced by gratitude. We expanded the garden her mother loved, planted new roses, added a stone bench with her name carved into it. Some evenings my daughter and I sat there as the sun dropped behind the trees. And I told her stories about the woman who taught me patience, who believed security came from roots, not displays. She listened the way she had as a child, quietly, thoughtfully. And sometimes she cried, sometimes she smiled. Healing is not a straight line, it is a return, again and again, to places that remind you who you were before fear interfered. One night she asked if I regretted keeping our finances quiet, if knowing more would have saved her sooner. I thought about it carefully before answering, and told her the truth. Money attracts attention, but ignorance attracts predators too. There is no perfect shield, only preparation and trust. She had learned to listen to herself, to ask for help when something felt wrong, and that skill would protect her longer than any account balance ever could. She leaned against me and said she loved me, and I told her I always would. The sky darkened. The garden rustled softly in the wind, and I understood something my wife had always known. Real wealth is not what you accumulate. It is what stands beside you when everything else falls apart. And I would spend the rest of my life protecting that patiently, quietly, without regret. 3 months after the ceremony that never finished, the ranch returned to its old rhythm. Mornings quiet, evenings long, and space to breathe again. The legal consequences unfolded without spectacle. Paperwork instead of shouting, restrictions instead of drama. The kind of justice that changes futures without feeding headlines. My daughter stayed with me for a while, not hiding, just grounding herself. Therapy appointments, slow walks along the fence line. Conversations that began awkward and ended honest. I watched her rebuild trust inward first, learning that fear does not mean weakness. It means awareness delayed by hope. Some nights she slept deeply. Other nights she sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark. But she was moving forward, not backward. And that mattered more than speed. Healing is not loud. It is repetitive, steady, and often invisible until one day you realize the weight is lighter. I remained exactly who I had always been. Same truck, same habits, same deliberate quiet. But something had changed beneath the routine. Vigilance had softened into certainty. The need to watch every shadow replaced by the comfort of truth already spoken. We expanded the garden her mother loved. Added new beds, richer soil, roses she would have chosen herself. I placed a stone bench there with her name carved clean and simple. Number dates, no titles, just presence. My daughter and I sat there many evenings. Letting silence do the work words could not. I told her stories about her mother. Not heroic ones, but practical ones, about choosing land over status. Patience over impulse, security over image. She listened the way she used to when she was small. Knees drawn up, eyes focused, absorbing values rather than instructions. I realized then that legacy is not money passed down. It is perspective passed forward. One evening, she asked if I ever regretted keeping our wealth quiet. If knowing more would have saved her sooner, I thought carefully before answering. Because regret deserves honesty. I told her there is no perfect shield. Visibility attracts predators. Secrecy attracts curiosity. What protects you is not knowledge alone, but discernment, the ability to pause, to listen inward, to ask for help without shame. She had done that, even at the last possible moment, and that choice would protect her longer than any structure I could design. She leaned against me and said she loved me, and I told her I always would. The sky dimmed. The garden rustled softly, and I understood something that had guided me my whole life. Wealth is not what you show, or even what you save. It is what stands with you when everything else falls away. And I would protect that quietly, patiently, for as long as I lived.